but we'll bring them along to the picnic. We'll picnic on computer as well as the things there. We're going to be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 21 this morning. A fairly lengthy passage, but it's a story, and good for us to hear it all at once. 1 Samuel 21 starts and says, "Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to David trembling and said to him, 'Why are you alone and no one with you?' And David said to Ahimelech the priest, 'The king has charged me with the matter and said to me, let no one know anything about the matter which I send you and with which I have charged you. And I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here.' And the priest answered David and said, 'I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have kept themselves pure from women, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women.' And David answered the priest, 'Truly women have been kept from us, as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?' So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained by the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. And David said to Ahimelech, Then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste.' And the priest said, 'The sword of Goliath the Philistine, who you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, for there is none but that are here.' And David said, There is none like that. Give it to me. And David rose and fled on that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another in dances? Saul struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s.' And David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane, and let his spittle run down his beard. And Achish said to the servants, 'Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?'" Quite an interesting story from the scriptures, but one I think that again gives us an insight into the personality and the person of King David. Perhaps some of you may know, but I kind of doubt that not a lot of you know, that Joyce always had a desire in her heart to go to Africa. Joyce is my wife, by the way. And she waited all of her life until she turned 50, and when she turned 50, I bought her a ticket to Africa, and we went with my son. I went with her. I didn't just send her off. We went together and went to Africa and fulfilled one of her great wishes. We went to one of the poorest countries in Africa, one of the lowest rates of literacy in Africa, a place called the Gambia. The Gambia was a place that was 95% Muslim, and so we went there, not declaring ourselves to be a mission group, but just a government agency, that we would be there to help people. And it was an interesting time. We spent 6 weeks there, got to know a number of people really well, were involved in a number of different aspects of ministry. But in my spare time, I really wanted to see how a Muslim country functioned. We hear a lot in the news, or see a lot on the news, things going on. And sometimes, I don't know if you look at them the same way, but I kind of look at them and kind of think, I wonder if that's daily practice, or maybe they just found some people going crazy in a certain place. And so one of the things I did was open up my eyes to see how they handled different kinds of situations. The only time I saw them really, really excited and dancing around and pushing each other and having a great time is when their under 20 soccer team won a game at their soccer stadium. And they went crazy wild over it. And that was an interesting thing. For the rest of the time, they behaved very much like you and I, very quietly. But there was one thing I was interested in, and one thing was to me was, how do they treat those amongst them who are different? How do they treat those amongst them who are sick or ill? And I especially focused on mental illness because it became obvious that there were a few individuals that crossed our path that were dealing with issues of not necessarily of a spiritual nature, although they could have been, but certainly issues that we would call some sort of mental problems or emotional problems. One fellow I watched, we were at a village waiting for our bus to come through, and it was late by a couple hours, so we went and sat in the shade of a tree, and we were just watching and looking around, and there was a young man who was noticeably different than everybody else in the groups. And not only were us in our group, I think there was 3 or 4 of us from our group sitting and waiting, not only were we watching him, but everybody in the square that we were sitting in were watching this young man. Of course, we've heard the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. And what I saw happening in that case was that the whole village was watching out for this young man. Not that they were being nice to him all the time, but they certainly were careful that he didn't get in the way of the tourists because they thought we had money to spend, or he didn't get into a fight, or he didn't get into trouble in front of us, because they felt that it would shame them as a Muslim. And so we spent some time with them. The young man actually came up and talked to us a little bit of gibberish here and there, and then one of the people out of the crowd that were kind of casually walking amongst us came up and sat down beside us and interrupted our conversation with this young man and took us on a different pathway. And so I thought to myself, that's interesting. It's almost the same way we deal with those kind of things. We don't make a big hullabaloo of things, but we try and make sure, oh, look at that, we got a computer. We try and focus on the person and make sure they're okay, but we also guard and watch ourselves. There was one other guy that stood out to me. I had problems with him. He came and tried to trick me into something, and I just barely got away from being tricked. My son kept on being agitated by this fellow. He was an agitating kind of man. One night our son, interesting in foreign countries, when certain chocolate bars hit the shelves, everybody knows about it. So we were about a kilometer away from the place that, the gas station that all of a sudden had caramel bar or something like that. And so he went out to get as many of them as he could, because if you find them, you buy them all and give them to your friends in little bits and pieces. But he went and did that, and this fellow who was agitated came up to him and started to bark at him and yell at him and tell him all of these things, and tell him he'd stolen from him and he needed this and all that. My son was very casual and dismissed him as much as he could, until 2 soldiers showed up. And they came up to my son and they said, "Is that man bothering you?" No, my son said, "No, I can deal with it." He says, "We can beat him up if you want." He said, "We beat him up all the time. Every day we beat him up, but he still doesn't change. There's something wrong with him." Perhaps there is. David all of a sudden found him in a sort of a similar situation. He found himself in a place where there was mental illness in the form of a man named Saul. Not only was he mentally ill, but he had a problem with his identity. It would come and it would go. And sometimes he would create all sorts of problems, especially for David. Now, David had been anointed king, but he was never crowned as king, at least not up until this point. He'd just been forced out of the court. Saul had Saul had alternated between lucid and lunatic. It was some sort of a thing that needed to be kept quiet. There are things that happen in the palaces of England that we have no clues about, right, Sheila? Well, Sheila will let you know, but she knows about palaces of England, I'm sure. But in those palaces, there are secrets that are kept that nobody knows about. And I have a feeling that David was caught in one of those situations. His boss was having all sorts of problems. His boss was struggling with his own identity. His boss is creating problems not only for the people around him, but nobody is allowed to say anything about it. And David ends up having to run away. Saul sends him out to raise an army, but there's no official transfer. There's no trooping of the colors. There's no official change of guard. He's just told, go out there, take the army, and do whatever you can. And so David begins his time in the wilderness. Almost a third of the time that David has been anointed king will be spent in the wilderness, surrounded by his adversaries. Saul spends the next few years trying to capture and kill David, chasing him from place to place to place. Now we're kind of trying to figure out what it takes to bring together a man of God's own heart. What does it mean to be a man of God's own heart, and how do you become that? Well, one thing for sure is that we discover that the making of a man after God's own heart, in David's case, does not come from a life of peace and comfort. If you're expecting peace and comfort to give you the kind of life that God wants you to have, maybe you're looking in the wrong places, because in David's life, his strength and his power, his integrity, his very life, his leadership, and all of those things came out of the fact that he was being chased. He didn't have comfort. He didn't have easy things going on. And in fact, maybe in the back of David's mind, and if you read the Psalms, you could sometimes hear the back of David's mind going, God, why have you brought me to this place? I was perfectly happy looking after my dad's sheep. I was perfectly happy being a shepherd. I was perfectly happy being able to do the things that I could do. But now you have placed me in a place that's unsafe. You've placed me in a place that scares me and worries me. Why are you allowing it to happen? Now, not only is David persecuted by Saul, but he has to seek security in the midst of his enemies, the Philistines. The Philistines had been attacking or trying to move in on the territory of Canaan for over 500 years at this time. They had fought hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of battles together. Sometimes the Philistines would win, sometimes the nation of Israel would win. But whatever happened, they would create enemies between each other. Achish, that we learn about, is a Philistine, but he's also the king of a city named Gath. Now, I don't know how quickly your minds work, but do you remember a fellow named Goliath? He was a big guy. Anybody remember where Goliath was from? Well, believe it or not, he was from Gath. Goliath of Gath. That's the person that David killed. And here we have David in one of his very first times looking out for the troubles that are around him, and here he discovers a king from Gath, maybe even related to Goliath. Certainly people would have known about it. That's David. He's the guy with the sling. He's the guy that killed our great-great-uncle, brother, father, friend, Goliath. We need to somehow do something about it. And not only that, there are songs that are written for this man David. Songs that he killed 10,000s. That's us. that they're talking about. 10,000 had been torn, and David had been a thorn in their side for as long as he was in power. The Philistines tried to establish cities in Canaan again for 500 years, and David was charged for defeating them. Now it's interesting that there's only one sword in the land that David can lay his hands on. If we look back into the history of the Philistines, we discover that they were the ones who had the manufacturing skills to be able to make weapons out of steel. And they made those weapons for anybody who would come and buy them. But they also held on to the technology of how to take those weapons and sometimes farming implements and how to sharpen them and make them sharper. And the only sword that David would have available is Goliath's. Celebrating 500 years of technical superiority, the nation of the Philistines would say, a fellow with a good sword is worth 10 without a sword. And David was a reminder to them that they may be able to kill their hundreds, but Saul was able to kill their thousands, and David their tens of thousands, even without the proper equipment. David was also a man of God. Within our extended family, we have a gentleman that you could safely call a legalist. He will condemn and praise you backwards and forwards for what he thinks the scriptures are telling him to do. Now, I'm not calling him a Pharisee. I love him very much, but there are some similarities when we come to argument. Even the Pharisees had fundamental problems in the way that in the way that they understood the scriptures. Passages like this one found in Samuel make legalists uncomfortable. Let's see if I can track it down here. No, we'll just go on from where we were. David shows little regard for the law of Moses. He comes to the temple, to the place where the all offerings are given. There was an instruction from Moses that there was a table, they call it the showbread. And on that table, every day had to be supplied fresh unleavened loaves, kind of like pancakes. There needed to be 10 of them. They were only good for one day. At the end of that day, they were taken away. Most of them were given to the Levites, who had the responsibility of being fed by the altar of worship and fed by other Israelites. But they were to be taken away, thrown into the garbage, and 10 new loaves were supposed to be baked early in the morning and laid out again. Those loaves were only for the holy ones, only for the priests, only for those who served in the sanctuary, the sons of Levi. No one else was given, favored to be able to have that bread. But David comes up very boldly and says, well, if you don't have any normal bread, we'll take the stuff that's going into the garbage. It's garbage anyways. And then they start quoting it. Well, we've kept ourselves pure and also. Those instructions are not in the scriptures at all. The scriptures are very plain. These breads, this food is not for ordinary people. It is for the people that we call holy and clean because they're doing something special in the house of God for you. They're taking your sacrifices for you and they're looking after things. David doesn't seem to care too much. Laws were one thing, but here David attacks one of the foundations of the faith. There are things that are holy and things that are profane. And he had no right to ask or receive, except that he understands that at the basic level, the Sabbath was made for man, and not the man for Sabbath. Now, do we think it always pleases God when we destroy ceremonial things, when people are starving? Think about it for a second. If you were given the task of having a bunch of bread, and there were people, hungry people around you, would you care? Whether or not they had washed, would you care? Whether or not they had done the proper things, would you care? I don't think so. I think that you understand that the law of God is there, and it has some flexibility within it. It has some ability to work within what people's needs are. And at certain times, people need more than just the words of the law. At certain times, people need to have food in their belly. And I think that that's one of the things that David saw. The Pharisees couldn't understand that. And yet that seems to be the basis of Jesus' teaching to them. Now, we need to exercise caution. We can already see the willingness of human beings to forgive their own sins. Being ceremonially clean is a good thing, but not a substitute for being of the right tribe and being in the proper place in the instructions. And one of the things that we need to understand is that we continue to be in this great war against the forces of evil together. And one of the hopes of mankind has it that we will be forgiven what we don't know, or at least what we haven't been taught. In other words, we're going to come up with the defense when we stand before God as, I didn't know. I didn't know that I was doing wrong things. When David senses the restlessness of Achish rising, he starts to feign madness. Interesting how he feigns madness. He marks the side of a pillar of a house with his nails, and then he starts to drool and to dribble. Kind of sounds just like me at Thanksgiving, but that's beside the point. There's a good chance that there's madness in the house of Saul. And nobody really understands it. Remember, it was a secret? It's still a secret. Achish is coming and he's looking at David, and he's looking at him and he's saying, oh, this guy's mad. Is everybody mad in the house of Saul? Is everybody crazy that the people I'm supposed to try to meet? One thing you can't do, you're going to waste your time if you try to reason with a crazy person. You're going to waste your time if you try and set such people on the right pathway, because they just don't get it. If Achish identifies David, culturally, he's going to be responsible for him. If anybody at that time would say, well, this man's crazy, they would look at him and say, no, he's your responsibility. Treat him well, and we hope that he will do well. And that includes David. And so David says to Achish, I'm the one that you're looking for, but I'm crazy. And if you get me, you get all of me. And David does. Give all of him to chase the Philistines from their land. We're going to call her an end there. I'm going to ask Merv if he would join me up at the front. We're going to sing a hymn.